The Second World War. The rise of darkness, from the Great War to global conflict. The year is 1919. A great silence has fallen over the battlefields of Europe. The guns have finally stopped their thunderous roar after 4 long years of brutal conflict. An entire generation had been consumed by the Great War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and horror. Cities lay in ruins. Empires had crumbled into dust. Millions of young men would never return home. In the streets of London, Paris, and New York, crowds gathered to celebrate the armistice. There was an overwhelming sense of relief, a collective exhale from a world that had held its breath in terror. This was meant to be the war to end all wars, a final bloody sacrifice to secure a future of lasting peace and prosperity for all mankind. This newfound hope was palpable in the air. People dared to dream again of a better world, one built on cooperation and mutual respect, rather than trenches and machine guns. Leaders from across the globe converged on Paris, determined to forge a new international order from the ashes of the old. Self-determination for nations, open diplomacy, a League of Nations that would prevent future conflicts through dialogue and collective security. The promises were grand, and for a brief shining moment, it seemed as though humanity had learned its terrible lesson. The victory parades were not just celebrations of military triumph. They were celebrations of survival and the dawn of a new era. Yet beneath the surface of this joyous relief, the scars of war ran deep. The physical destruction was immense. The psychological wounds were even deeper. Families were broken, forever missing fathers, sons, and brothers. Soldiers returned home with shattered bodies and haunted minds, struggling to reintegrate into a society that could never truly understand what they had endured. The economies of Europe were in shambles, burdened by massive debts and the immense cost of rebuilding. The old certainties were gone. The world had been irrevocably changed, and the path forward was far from clear, clouded by grief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of loss. This period of hope was therefore tinged with a profound sense of anxiety. The very foundations of civilization had been shaken to their core. Could the old structures truly be rebuilt, or had something essential been lost forever in the mud of Flanders? The leaders gathered at Versailles faced an impossible task to satisfy the competing demands of victorious nations, to justly punish the defeated, and to create a framework for peace that would endure. The weight of the world rested on their shoulders. They were tasked not just with ending a war, but with preventing the next one. The stakes could not have been higher, and the seeds of future conflict were already being sown in the very halls where peace was being negotiated. The peace that followed the Great War was fragile from its very inception. It was a peace built on a foundation of compromise, resentment, and unresolved tensions. For the victorious powers, Britain and France, there was a burning desire for security and retribution. They had sacrificed too much to let Germany, the perceived aggressor, escape unpunished. For the defeated nations, especially Germany, the terms of the peace felt like a national humiliation. The treaty imposed crippling reparations, stripped away territories, and forced them to accept sole blame for the war. This dictated peace bred a deep and lasting bitterness that would poison the political landscape for years to come. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, in the opulent Hall of Mirrors, the very same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed nearly 50 years earlier. The symbolism was deliberate and deeply cutting. This was not a negotiation between equals. It was a verdict delivered by the victors to the vanquished. The terms were harsh, designed to cripple Germany and ensure it could never again threaten the peace of Europe. France, having borne the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front, was particularly insistent on severe measures. They demanded not just peace, but retribution. The treaty redrew the map of Europe, carving up old empires and creating new nations. But its primary focus was the punishment of Germany. The territorial changes were drastic and immediate. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies, which were distributed among the Allied powers. More painfully, it lost significant territories in Europe. The industrial region of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, a wound that had festered since 1871. Other areas were ceded to Belgium, Denmark, and the newly reconstituted Poland. The Polish Corridor, a strip of land designed to give Poland access to the sea, cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany, creating a source of immediate and lasting friction. The Saarland, rich in coal, was placed under the administration of the League of Nations for 15 years. Its valuable resources funneled to France as compensation. Beyond the loss of land, the treaty aimed to dismantle Germany's military might. The German army was to be reduced to a mere 100,000 men, a force barely sufficient for internal policing. Its navy was severely restricted. It was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. The Rhineland, a crucial industrial and strategic area bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. These clauses were intended to render Germany incapable of waging aggressive war. For the German people, however, who had been fed a diet of propaganda proclaiming their army's invincibility, these terms were not just a strategic limitation. They were a profound national emasculation and a source of deep-seated shame. The most contentious part of the treaty, however, was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. This article forced Germany and its allies to accept full and sole responsibility for causing the war and all the loss and damage it had inflicted. This clause was the legal basis for the massive reparations that would be demanded later, but its moral impact was even greater. It branded an entire nation as the aggressor, a label that many Germans, from ordinary citizens to political leaders, vehemently rejected. They felt they had been drawn into a wider conflict, and this forced confession of guilt created a powerful sense of injustice that would fester and poison German politics for the next 2 decades. The economic consequences of the Treaty of Versailles were as devastating as its political terms and its military terms. The War Guilt Clause was not just a moral judgment. It was the key that unlocked Germany's treasury for the Allies. In 1921, the final bill was presented. 132 billion gold marks, an amount equivalent to hundreds of billions today. A debt designed not just to repay the war, but to keep Germany shackled for generations. Victors needed money, especially France and Belgium, both indebted to the United States. For Germany, the burden was impossible to bear. It was already exhausted. Factories ruined, trade collapsed, and it had lost its most valuable industrial territories like the Saar and Upper Silesia. The Weimar government printed ever more money. Hyperinflation followed. By 1923, the mark was virtually worthless. Citizens pushed wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread. Savings wiped out overnight, the middle class destroyed, and millions plunged into poverty. Economic chaos destabilized politics. Weimar was blamed for accepting the treaty and for the collapse. Reparations became a symbol of humiliation and foreign oppression. Every payment felt like betrayal. Extremist movements rose, on the left and on the right, promising to tear up the treaty and restore Germany's honor. Failure to pay led to more conflict. In 1923, Germany defaulted and French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr. They seized coal and goods as payment in kind. Occupation sparked passive resistance, crippling the economy further and fueling nationalist anger. International loans and a renegotiation stabilized things temporarily, but the damage was done. Versailles had created a vicious cycle of economic hardship and political resentment, making lasting peace far harder to achieve. Europe in turmoil. The instability was not confined to Germany. Across the continent, the old world lay in ruins. The war had not just destroyed buildings and infrastructure, it had shattered societies. Ruined farms stretched across northern France and Belgium, the land poisoned by shells and littered with unexploded ordnance. Millions of people were displaced, becoming refugees in their own countries or fleeing across newly drawn borders that paid little heed to ethnic or linguistic realities. The war had also broken families on an epic scale. A generation of women was left without husbands. Countless children grew up without fathers, creating a deep social and demographic scar. This widespread sense of loss and dislocation fueled political violence. The end of the war did not bring an end to the fighting. In Russia, a brutal civil war raged between the Bolshevik Reds and the counter-revolutionary Whites. In Ireland, a bitter war for independence erupted against British rule. In the lands of the former Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, new nations struggled violently to define their borders and establish their authority. Paramilitary groups, often composed of demobilized soldiers who knew nothing but violence, roamed the countryside and battled in the streets of cities like Berlin, Munich, and Budapest. Politics became militarized, with debate often replaced by assassinations and street brawls. The economic hardship was a universal plague. Every major European combatant was burdened with enormous war debts. The intricate pre-war web of global trade had been destroyed, and protectionist policies began to rise as each nation tried to shield its own struggling industries. This led to widespread unemployment and poverty. In this climate of despair, the promises of liberal democracy, which had seemed so bright in 1919, began to ring hollow for many. People were hungry, jobless, and desperate for solutions. They craved order and stability, and they were increasingly willing to listen to radical voices that promised to deliver it by any means necessary. This connection between economic despair and political extremism became one of the defining features of the interwar years. Radical movements, both communist and nationalist, gained traction by feeding on the public's anger and fear. They presented a simple narrative: the existing system had failed, and only a complete overthrow of the old order could save the nation. They offered scapegoats, foreign powers, political rivals, or ethnic minorities to blame for the country's problems. The chaos and suffering that followed the Great War created a perfect breeding ground for ideologies that rejected compromise, celebrated violence, and promised a return to greatness through authoritarian rule. The rise of the strongmen. In this cauldron of post-war chaos, new political figures emerged, promising to restore order through strength and national unity. The first of these was Benito Mussolini in Italy. Mussolini propaganda poster with Italian flag and fascist symbol. Italy had been on the winning side of the war, but many Italians felt cheated at the peace conference, denied the territorial gains they'd been promised. The country was plagued by strikes, political instability, a deep fear of a communist revolution. Mussolini, a former socialist journalist and a war veteran, harnessed this discontent. He organized his followers, the Black Shirts. He turned them into a paramilitary force that violently suppressed opponents. They projected discipline and power. Mussolini's movement, fascism, was a powerful new ideology, intensely nationalistic, authoritarian, anti-democratic. It glorified violence and military conquest. It preached absolute loyalty to the leader, Il Duce. It promised a new Italian state to recapture Roman glory. In 1922, Mussolini threatened to march on Rome with his Black Shirts. Fearing civil war, the king appointed Mussolini prime minister. Within years, he dismantled democratic institutions. He established a one-party dictatorship, a chilling blueprint. A similar movement was taking shape in Germany. Among disaffected veterans was a young Austrian corporal, Adolf Hitler, consumed by bitterness over defeat and the Treaty of Versailles. In chaotic Munich, he joined the German Workers' Party. With powerful oratory and radical ideas, he rose to lead it and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Like Mussolini, Hitler organized a private army, the Brown Shirts, also called the SA. They battled rivals and intimidated the public. They offered a toxic brew that resonated with angry Germans. They promised to rip up the Versailles Treaty, rebuild the military, restore Germany to power. Central to their ideology was virulent racial anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for Germany's problems. In 1923, inspired by Mussolini, Hitler attempted the beer hall putsch in Munich. The attempt failed, and Hitler was briefly imprisoned. The event gave him national notoriety. He had found a voice for the voiceless and angry. The global economic crash of 1929 was the final, fatal blow to Germany's fragile Weimar Republic. As American loans dried up and global trade collapsed, Germany's economy plunged into a deep depression. Unemployment skyrocketed, with millions of Germans finding themselves jobless and destitute. The political center could not hold. The moderate parties bickered and failed to find solutions, leading to a state of near-permanent political paralysis. In this climate of fear and desperation, the German people turned to the political extremes. The Communist Party gained support, but the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, saw an astonishing surge. Hitler's message of national salvation blamed Jews in the Versailles Treaty, and it found a massive, receptive audience. The Nazis' rise was achieved through a clever, two-pronged strategy. On the streets, the SA or brown shirts waged intimidation and violence, especially against communists. They created an image of being the only force strong enough to restore order. At the same time, Hitler pursued a path of legal power. He presented himself as a legitimate political candidate, participating in elections and using sophisticated propaganda to spread the Nazi message. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. They were not a majority, but their position made it impossible for any stable government to be formed without them. The traditional conservative elites, men of industry, military, and aristocracy, fatally underestimated Hitler. They despised the chaos of Weimar democracy and feared a communist takeover. They saw Hitler as a vulgar but useful tool. They believed they could appoint him as chancellor, give him a taste of power, and then control him from behind the scenes. In a catastrophic miscalculation, President Paul von Hindenburg, an aged war hero, was persuaded to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. The conservatives thought they had tamed the radical. In reality, they had just handed him the keys to the state. Once in power, Hitler moved with breathtaking speed to dismantle democracy. Less than a month after his appointment, the Reichstag building was set on fire. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists, creating an atmosphere of national emergency. Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, an emergency measure that suspended basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the press. This decree effectively gave the Nazis a legal basis to arrest and imprison their political opponents without trial. The gambit had worked. Within weeks, the foundations of German democracy were shattered, and the path was cleared for the establishment of a total dictatorship. Nazis began to systematically impose their ideology on every aspect of German life. At the core of Nazism was a fanatical belief in racial purity. They promoted the idea of an Aryan master race. Propaganda showed the German people as the purest example. All other races were labeled inferior. Jewish people were placed at the very bottom. Anti-Semitism was not just a political tool. It was a central, driving obsession. They passed the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. The laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship. The laws forbade marriages or relations with Aryans. Jews were systematically excluded from public life, excluded from professions, excluded from schools. This ideology of hate was ruthlessly enforced by a terrifying state security apparatus. The Gestapo, the secret state police. The Gestapo encouraged citizens to spy on neighbors. Fear and suspicion spread across communities. Those deemed enemies of the state, Jews, communists, socialists, homosexuals, anyone who dared to dissent. These people were arrested. They were sent to newly established concentration camps like Dachau. These camps were not yet the later extermination camps. They were brutal sites of forced labor, sites of torture, sites of political re-education, the institutional pillars of a free society, a free press, independent courts, rival political parties. All were destroyed or absorbed in Gleichschaltung, or coordination. Beyond racial purity at home, the second pillar was Lebensraum, living space. Hitler claimed Germany was overcrowded. He argued the nation needed to expand eastward to survive. That meant conquering Poland and the Soviet Union. The Slavic peoples were deemed racially inferior, Untermenschen. They were to be displaced, enslaved, or exterminated to make way for German settlers. This was not traditional colonialism. It was genocidal racial re-engineering. It made a future war in Eastern Europe inevitable in Hitler's mind. To achieve Lebensraum, Germany needed rearmament. In violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler began a massive secret military buildup. Factories churned out tanks. Factories churned out planes. Factories churned out submarines. Conscription was reintroduced in 1935. The German army swelled. The state poured resources into creating the Wehrmacht, a modern advanced fighting force. Rearmament prepared Germany for war. It also helped solve unemployment, boosting Hitler's popularity at home. The world watched with growing unease. Institutional failures abroad seemed to paralyze any effective international response. While fascism was casting its shadow over Europe, a parallel and equally aggressive expansionism was taking root in the Far East. The Empire of Japan, an island nation with few natural resources, had rapidly modernized in the late 19th century. Its leaders, a powerful clique of military officers and industrialists, believed that Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia. They sought to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an empire that would eject Western colonial powers and secure the resources: oil, rubber, minerals. This ambition put Japan on a direct collision course with China and the Western powers who had interests in the region. Unlike Germany and Italy, Japan's turn towards militarism was not led by a single charismatic dictator. Instead, power shifted steadily away from the civilian government and into the hands of the military. Radical, ultra-nationalist officers, often acting without direct orders from Tokyo, began to dictate foreign policy. They assassinated prime ministers who were perceived as too moderate. They fostered a cult of emperor worship and promoted martial glory within Japanese society. They saw the democratic West as decadent and weak, and believed that Japan's spiritual and racial superiority gave it the right to rule over its neighbors. Their goals were clear: secure resources and establish regional hegemony. The first major act of aggression came in 1931. Using a fabricated incident on a railway line as a pretext, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich province in northeastern China. They quickly overran the region and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. The international community was shocked. The League of Nations, the body designed to prevent such aggression, investigated and condemned Japan's actions. In a gesture of defiance, the Japanese delegation simply walked out of the League in 1933. The League proved powerless. It had no army to enforce its decisions, and its key members, like Britain and France, were unwilling to impose meaningful economic sanctions, fearful of provoking a wider conflict. The failure to stop Japan in Manchuria was a critical turning point. It exposed the League of Nations as a paper tiger and sent a clear signal to other aggressor nations that the international order was weak and unwilling to defend its own principles. Mussolini would soon follow Japan's example by invading Ethiopia, and Hitler would watch and learn, concluding that he too could defy international treaties without fear of serious repercussions. The League of Nations, the world's great hope for collective security, proved to be a toothless tiger, unable to stop Japan in Manchuria or Italy in Ethiopia. In 1937, Japan escalated its campaign in China, launching a full-scale invasion. The brutal conflict that followed, marked by atrocities like the rape of Nanking, became the bloody opening chapter of World War II in Asia, while the world's great powers stood by and watched. First cracks in the dam, rearmament, and the Rhineland. Emboldened by the world's inaction over Japan's invasion of Manchuria, Hitler decided it was time to test the resolve of the former Allies. His first major gamble came in March 1936. In a flagrant violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Treaties, he ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone on Germany's western border with France. This was a moment of extreme tension. Hitler's own generals were nervous. The newly rebuilt German army was still weak and no match for the powerful French military. They had given the soldiers secret orders to retreat immediately if the French showed any sign of resistance. The world held its breath, but the response never came. France, despite having the military superiority to easily expel the German forces, was paralyzed by political division and a deep-seated defensive mentality. They would not act without the support of Great Britain. The British government, however, viewed the situation with a dangerous sense of calm. The prevailing opinion in London was that Hitler was merely marching into his own back garden. Many felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh to begin with, and that this was a reasonable German grievance being corrected. There was no appetite for a military confrontation over a patch of German soil. The successful remilitarization of the Rhineland was a massive triumph for Hitler, domestically and internationally. At home, his popularity soared. He had faced down the Western powers and erased one of the most humiliating clauses of the Versailles Treaty without a single shot being fired. His gamble had paid off spectacularly, silencing the doubters within his own military and government and solidifying his image as a leader of immense foresight and daring. He had learned a crucial lesson. Britain and France were haunted by the memory of the Great War and lacked the political will to enforce the treaty. They talked tough, but when confronted with decisive action, they backed down. For the international order, the remilitarization of the Rhineland was a disaster. It was the last real chance to stop Hitler with relatively little risk. Once the Rhineland was fortified with the German West Wall, it became impossible for France to easily intervene in Eastern Europe to protect its allies like Poland or Czechoslovakia. The strategic balance of power in Europe had shifted decisively in Germany's favor. The Great Betrayal, Appeasement, and Czechoslovakia. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions grew bolder, having successfully annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Without any international opposition, he turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. This prosperous democratic nation was a creation of the Versailles Treaty and an ally of France. It also had a significant German-speaking population concentrated in a border region known as the Sudetenland. Egged on by Nazi propaganda, Sudeten German leaders began to demand autonomy. Then they demanded union with Germany. Hitler loudly championed their cause, threatening to invade if their demands were not met. He manufactured a crisis that brought Europe to the brink of war in autumn 1938. This crisis became the ultimate test of the policy known as appeasement. Led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, appeasement was rooted in a genuine, desperate desire to avoid another catastrophic war. Chamberlain, like many of his generation, was haunted by the slaughter of World War I. He believed that Hitler had limited, understandable grievances stemming from the Versailles Treaty, and that these could be satisfied through negotiation. He saw himself as a peacemaker, willing to go to great lengths to prevent a conflict. He failed to understand the limitless, ideological nature of Hitler's ambitions. For Hitler, the Sudeten crisis was not about self-determination for Germans. It was about destroying Czechoslovakia as a step towards conquering Lebensraum. In a series of tense meetings, culminating in the Munich Conference in September 1938, Chamberlain, Édouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini, in a desperate bid to preserve peace, they made a fateful decision. They agreed to all of Hitler's demands, forcing Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland to Germany. Crucially, the Czechoslovaks themselves were not invited to the conference. Their fate was decided for them by the great powers. Chamberlain returned to London a hero, waiving the agreement and famously declaring he had secured, peace for our time. He believed he had averted war by satisfying Hitler's last territorial demand in Europe. The Munich Agreement was seen by many, including Winston Churchill, who called it a total and unmitigated defeat, as a great betrayal. Just 6 months later, German troops are shown marching into Prague, occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion of appeasement is shattered. The last days of peace, the Danzig crisis. After the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, appeasement lay in ruins. Chamberlain and others finally saw the truth. Hitler's promises were worthless. His aim was domination. Poland was next. The Versailles Treaty created the Polish Corridor, splitting Germany. Danzig became a free city under the League. Hitler demanded their return. Britain and France vowed to stand firm. They issued a formal guarantee to Poland, a clear line in the sand. They hoped to deter Hitler. He called their bluff in August 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, publicly non-aggression, secretly a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres, German sphere, Soviet sphere. They agreed to carve up Poland. With the Soviet Union neutralized, Hitler could attack Poland first. Diplomacy in late August was for show. Hitler wanted a pretext. On August 31st, SS troops in Polish uniforms staged the Gleiwitz incident. They broadcast an anti-German message in Polish. They left bodies of prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers. The final lie was set. The war machine was ready to roll. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war on Poland. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, the German war machine roared across the Polish border. The world was about to witness a terrifying new form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was not the static trench warfare of the Great War. It was a strategy built on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. The German plan involved concentrating fast-moving armored divisions, the panzers, at key points to smash through the enemy's defenses. These armored spearheads would then drive deep into the enemy's rear, sowing chaos, cutting supply lines, and encircling vast formations of troops. It was a doctrine of surgical shock and awe, designed to achieve a swift and decisive victory before the enemy could even fully mobilize. The Polish army, though brave and numerous, was tragically outmatched. It was an army designed for a 1918-style conflict, relying heavily on infantry and cavalry. They were deployed in a thin line along the country's long and indefensible border, making them vulnerable to the concentrated German thrusts. Above them, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, quickly established total air superiority. Stuka dive bombers, with their terrifying sirens, acted as flying artillery, relentlessly attacking Polish troop concentrations, airfields, and communication hubs. The Polish Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground within the first 48 hours. Polish soldiers fought with incredible courage, but they were facing a military revolution. The speed of the German advance was breathtaking. Within a week, the Polish defensive lines had been shattered. Panzer divisions were racing towards the capital, Warsaw, leaving behind pockets of surrounded and bewildered Polish troops. The Western guarantees, which Poland had relied upon, proved hollow. On September 3rd, Britain and France, honoring their pledge, declared war on Germany. But this declaration brought no immediate relief. They were too slow to mobilize, and their military leaders were still thinking in terms of a long, drawn-out war. They launched no major offensive on the Western Front to take the pressure off their beleaguered ally. Poland was left to face the German onslaught almost entirely alone, a sacrifice to buy the West more time. The final blow came on September 17th. As German forces closed in on Warsaw from the west, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east, as secretly agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Attacked from two sides by two of the world's most powerful military dictatorships, the Polish state collapsed. Warsaw held out under a brutal siege, enduring relentless bombing and shelling that targeted civilians as much as military objectives, but finally surrendered on September 27th. Within a month, Poland had been conquered and erased from the map, partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Lightning War was a terrifying success. Hitler had won his first military campaign, and the world now understood the brutal efficiency of his new war machine. The Phony War and the Fall of France. Following the swift and brutal conquest of Poland, a strange and deceptive calm settled over Western Europe. Although Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, very little actual fighting took place. On the border between France and Germany, the two armies sat behind their massive fortifications, the French Maginot Line, the German Siegfried Line. This period, lasting from the autumn of 1939 to the spring of 1940, became known as the Phony War, the Blitzkrieg. For many, it felt as though the conflict might yet be avoided, that some kind of negotiated peace could still be reached. It was a period of eerie quiet, a calm before a storm of unimaginable fury. This lull was shattered on May 10, 1940. Hitler unleashed his Blitzkrieg on the West, simultaneous invasion of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. The Allied commanders had expected a repeat of the German plan from World War I, anticipating the main attack through the flat plains of central Belgium. They therefore rushed their best forces northwards, including the British Expeditionary Force. This, however, was exactly what the German High Command wanted them to do. The Allied plan played directly into a brilliant and daring German trap, the Manstein Plan. The main German assault did not come through central Belgium. Instead, the bulk of Germany's panzer divisions executed a high-risk maneuver. They drove through the dense and hilly Ardennes forest, a region the French had considered impassable for tanks. They punched through the weak French defenses on the Meuse River and then raced across northern France towards the English Channel. The Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium were now cut off from the rest of France. The German armored spearhead had acted like a sickle, swinging behind the main Allied force and trapping them against the coast. The strategic situation had become a catastrophe. The fall of France was shockingly swift. The French army, once considered the most powerful in the world, seemed to melt away before the German onslaught. Their command structure was rigid and slow to react. Their communications were poor, and their morale collapsed under the shock of the Blitzkrieg. The government fled Paris, which was declared an open city and occupied by German troops on June 14th. Refugees clogged the roads, machine-gunned by German aircraft, creating a scene of total chaos and despair. On June 22, 1940, less than 6 weeks after the invasion began, France signed an armistice with Germany in the very same railway carriage in which Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had his revenge. The continent now lay at his feet. Britain stands alone. The miracle of Dunkirk, with the French armies collapsing and the German panzers closing in, the Allied forces were squeezed into an ever-shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. Over 400,000 British soldiers, French soldiers, Belgian soldiers, pinned against the sea, their backs to the water. Their capture or annihilation seemed inevitable. Churchill made a defiant speech, vowing Britain would fight on the beaches and never surrender. Behind the scenes, the Royal Navy planned a desperate rescue mission, Operation Dynamo. It was an evacuation that few believed could succeed. The rescue began on May 26th. A heroic French rearguard fought to hold back the German armor. A heroic British rearguard held the line. The Royal Navy began ferrying soldiers from the harbor and beaches back to England. Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to halt for 2 days. He may have believed the Luftwaffe could finish the job, or perhaps he hoped to use the trapped army as a bargaining chip. This fatal pause and cloudy weather that hampered the German Air Force created a small window to escape. What happened next became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Large naval destroyers could not get close enough to the shallow beaches. A call went out across Britain for any vessel that could float to help. Fishing boats set sail. Yachts joined the flotilla. Pleasure cruisers answered the call. Merchant vessels sailed into the war zone, manned by civilian volunteers. They navigated through minefields, under constant air attack. They ferried soldiers to larger waiting warships. In some cases, they carried men all the way back to England, over 9 desperate days. The improvised Armada and Royal Navy rescued 338,000 Allied soldiers. It was not a victory. The BEF had been forced to abandon heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, but it was a deliverance. It saved the core of the British Army, allowing it to fight another day. The Dunkirk spirit galvanized the British people. France had fallen. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was allied with Hitler. Britain now stood completely alone, a small island nation facing a Nazi-dominated continent. With France defeated, Hitler was convinced that Britain would see reason and sue for peace. He was the master of Europe, and continued resistance seemed futile. But he fundamentally misread the mood of the British people and their new leader, Winston Churchill. In a series of powerful speeches, Churchill rejected any thought of surrender, offering only blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and vowing to fight on whatever the cost. Realizing that Britain would not be intimidated, Hitler ordered his generals to prepare for an invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. But before any invasion fleet could cross the English Channel, Germany first had to achieve one crucial objective. It had to destroy the Royal Air Force and gain total control of the skies over southern England. The Great Air Campaign, which would become known as the Battle of Britain, began in earnest in July 1940. The German Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, was confident. It outnumbered the Royal Air Force in bombers and had highly experienced pilots. Their strategy was to systematically destroy Royal Air Force airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, grinding down Britain's air defenses until they collapsed. For weeks, the skies over Kent, Sussex, and London became a vast aerial battlefield. Day after day, hundreds of German bombers, Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, flew across the Channel to be met by the Spitfires and Hurricanes. The battle was fought on a knife's edge. The Royal Air Force was pushed to its absolute limit. Pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, flew multiple sorties a day, fighting against exhaustion and overwhelming odds. On the ground, a sophisticated system of radar stations, the Chain Home Network, gave Britain a critical advantage. It allowed ground controllers to detect incoming German raids and vector the outnumbered Royal Air Force fighters to intercept them efficiently. Churchill famously paid tribute to the pilots of Fighter Command, declaring, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." It was a battle of technology, tactics, and sheer human endurance. In early September, frustrated by the Royal Air Force's stubborn resistance, Göring made a critical error. He shifted the focus of the Luftwaffe's attacks from Royal Air Force airfields to bombing London and other cities, a campaign that became known as the Blitz. This was intended to break the morale of the British people, but it had the opposite effect, stiffening their resolve. Crucially, it also gave the battered Royal Air Force airfields a desperately needed respite to repair and re-equip. On September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive daylight raid on London, believing the Royal Air Force to be on its last legs. Instead, they were met by a huge and coordinated defense that inflicted unsustainable losses. This day is now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. The Germans had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived. Britain stood as the last bastion of freedom, a lone island fortress facing the full might of Hitler's empire. The story that began with a celebration of peace had culminated in a desperate battle for survival, a conflict that had now truly become a Second World War. The darkness, born in the shadows of the First War, had now fully enveloped the continent. Yet, even at the moment of maximum darkness, a flicker of light remained. The defiance of Great Britain in the summer and the autumn of 1940 was more than a strategic event. It was a moral and psychological turning point. Logically, Britain should have negotiated a peace, accepting German hegemony in Europe in exchange for the survival of its own empire. Continued resistance seemed like a futile, suicidal gesture against overwhelming odds. The world expected Britain to yield, but Britain, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, refused. This refusal to surrender had profound consequences. It kept the flame of resistance alive in occupied Europe, giving hope to millions living under Nazi rule. It demonstrated to the world, particularly the United States, that Hitler was not invincible, and that the will to fight for freedom had not been extinguished. The successful defense of the island during the Battle of Britain was a practical victory of the highest order. It prevented a German invasion and ensured Britain remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the war could be taken back to the continent. It bought time, the most precious commodity in war. The battle was a testament to courage and resilience. It was won by the few, the RAF pilots, but sustained by the many, factory workers, radar operators, anti-aircraft gunners, and ordinary civilians who endured the Blitz with stoic resolve. The Dunkirk spirit had transformed into the Blitz spirit. This determination to resist, to carry on amid nightly bombing, showed that the morale of a free people could not be broken by terror alone. This was a moral victory as important as the military one, a statement that human dignity and freedom were worth fighting for. The World in Flames, Total War, 1941-1943. The year 1941 dawned upon a world already fractured by conflict. But this was the year the fires of war would spread, engulfing continents and oceans in a single, terrifying blaze. From the frozen plains of Eastern Europe to the warm waters of the Pacific, the nature of warfare was about to change irrevocably. The era of localized battles and contained aggression was over. A new, more brutal chapter was beginning. This was the moment regional conflicts fused into a truly global struggle, a conflagration that would demand everything from everyone, leaving no corner of the earth untouched by its shadow. The world was holding its breath, unknowingly standing on the precipice of total war. Suddenly, the storm broke. On the quiet morning of June 22, 1941, the fragile peace on the Eastern Front was shattered by the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. It was the largest and most audacious land invasion in human history, an operation of unimaginable scale and breathtaking ambition. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers, with thousands tanks and aircrafts, organized into 3 massive army groups, surged across the Soviet frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Their objective was nothing less than the complete destruction of the Soviet state and its Red Army, a goal Hitler expected to achieve in a matter of months before the onset of the brutal Russian winter. The German assault was a symphony of destruction, a perfected doctrine known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Thousands of tanks, the formidable panzers, formed armored spearheads that punched deep holes in the Soviet lines, driving relentlessly eastward. Close behind them followed waves of infantry, tasked with encircling and annihilating the dazed and disorganized Soviet defenders. Overhead, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, dominated the skies. They bombed airfields, destroying thousands of Soviet planes on the ground, and strafed columns of retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians, ensuring chaos reigned supreme. The initial shock was overwhelming, a tidal wave of steel and fire that seemed utterly unstoppable. The Soviet High Command, stunned by the speed and ferocity of the attack, struggled to mount a coherent response. In the opening weeks, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner in vast pockets of encirclement near Minsk and near Smolensk. For the German soldiers advancing through the endless fields of Ukraine and Belarus, victory seemed not only possible, but imminent. Yet this was not a war against an army alone. It was a war against a vast nation and its people. The sheer size of the country began to work against the German invaders. The front was too wide, the distances too great. As the German spearheads raced ahead, their supply lines became dangerously stretched, vulnerable to attack from bypassed pockets of Soviet soldiers and nascent partisan groups. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal von Lieb, they pushed into the Baltic states and toward the historic city of Leningrad. Capturing it would be a devastating blow to Soviet morale. In the center, Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock aimed for the Soviet capital, Moscow. This force contained the bulk of Germany's panzer divisions. The road to Moscow seemed wide open. To the south, Army Group South, led by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was tasked with conquering Ukraine, and beyond lay the oil fields of the Caucasus. The southern advance culminated in the massive Battle of Kiev. In the largest encirclement in history, the Germans captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The scale of the fighting was unprecedented. This three-pronged assault was the very definition of total war, a coordinated effort to break not just an army, but the entire structure of a nation. Despite the catastrophic initial defeats, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, a fierce and desperate resistance began to solidify. The Red Army continued to fight with savage determination. Stalin, in a radio address to the people, called for a great patriotic war. He authorized a scorched earth policy, designed to deny the German army the resources it desperately needed. As the German army pushed deeper, it encountered a new and insidious threat: the partisans. Operating from the vast forests and swamps behind German lines, they waged a relentless campaign of sabotage and guerrilla warfare. The fighting was characterized by a level of brutality rarely seen before. The German advance was not just a military operation. It was accompanied by special SS units, the Einsatzgruppen, tasked with the mass murder of Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies, turning the occupied territories into a vast killing field. As the summer of 1941 bled into a wet and muddy autumn, the Blitzkrieg began to lose its lightning speed. The autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, turned unpaved roads into impassable mud. Then winter arrived, early and ferocious. Temperatures plummeted. The German army was catastrophically unprepared. The German war machine was being frozen into paralysis by General Winter. The Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive before Moscow. Fresh, well-equipped divisions from Siberia, slamming into depleted German lines. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was not advancing. It was in full retreat. The myth of invincibility was shattered outside Moscow. The dream of quick victory died in the frozen wasteland before Moscow. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, a bleeding wound that would prove fatal to the Third Reich. The Blitzkrieg was over. The war of endurance had begun. Faced with the terrifying speed of the German advance, the Soviet Union undertook one of the most astonishing logistical feats in history: the mass evacuation of its industrial base. Over 1,500 large industrial enterprises were dismantled and transported thousands of miles eastward. Millions of skilled workers, engineers, and their families were evacuated along with their factories. In the brutal cold of the Siberian winter, they worked to reassemble their factories, often with no shelter overhead. Within months, factories that had once stood in Ukraine and Belarus were churning out tanks, aircraft, and artillery. This industrial heartland, safe from German bombers, would become the arsenal that armed the Red Army for its eventual push back to Berlin. While Germany had conquered vast territories, it had failed to capture the industrial capacity needed to cripple the Soviet war effort. The Germans had seized the husk, but the core of Soviet power had been moved out of reach. Day of Infamy, the Pacific Awakens. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning was about to be shattered. Without a declaration of war, waves of Japanese aircraft descended upon the unsuspecting base. The attack was a stunning success of military planning and execution. It was swift, precise, and utterly devastating. The attack also targeted airfields across the island, destroying hundreds of American aircraft on the ground, ensuring Japanese air supremacy over the battlefield. For the United States, it was a national trauma, a day which will live in infamy. The attack ended years of American isolationism in an instant, uniting a stunned and enraged nation behind the call to war. The next day, the United States officially declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on the United States, Italy declared war on the United States. The regional conflicts had now officially merged into a single, global war. However, the Japanese attack contained a critical strategic flaw. Crucially, the American aircraft carriers, which were out at sea on maneuvers, escaped the attack completely. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, it would be the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, that would prove to be the decisive weapon. They had awoken a powerful enemy, and soon, that enemy's carriers would come hunting for them. In the months following the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire launched a whirlwind offensive across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. One by one, Western colonial possessions fell like dominoes. Hong Kong surrendered. The seemingly impregnable British fortress of Singapore fell. Japanese forces landed in the Philippines, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March. Within 6 months, the Empire of the Sun stretched over a vast portion of the globe, and its leaders believed they had established a defensive line that the Americans could not breach. The Allies were in retreat everywhere, facing a determined and ruthless enemy who controlled a vast new empire and was digging in to defend it to the last man. The road back would be long and bloody. The Battle of Midway took place on 6 to 7 June 1942 and was the turning of the tide. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned a complex operation intended to lure and destroy the U.S. fleet. But the Americans had a secret weapon: intelligence. Station Hypo in Hawaii had partially broken the Japanese naval code. The trap was exposed. American dive bombers struck the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. In 5 minutes of flaming chaos, American bombs ripped through Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Later that day, Hiryu was found and sunk, a devastating, irreversible loss. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II. Japan lost its 4 best carriers and over 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. The battle shattered Japan's aura of invincibility. Initiative in the Pacific shifted to the United States. The strategy was called island hopping: capture key islands one by one and bringing American bombers closer to Japan. The first brutal test was the Guadalcanal campaign, an offensive against forces of the Empire of Japan in the Solomon Islands. It was fought between 7th of August 1942 and 9th of February 1943, on land, at sea, and in the air, leading to vicious close-quarters combat in the disease-ridden jungle. Life on these isolated islands was a living hell. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery. Victory measured in yards of blood-soaked ground. The Japanese defenders, bound by Bushido, refused to surrender. Every island assault, brutal frontal attacks to root out a dug-in, suicidal enemy. Guadalcanal set the grim pattern for the rest of the Pacific War, a slow, agonizing but unstoppable advance toward Japan. The Desert War. Rommel's Gambit. While the Pacific was ablaze, another war raged in North Africa. The German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, versus the British Commonwealth's 8th Army. The prize, Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Middle East oil fields. Rommel, master of desert warfare, bold tactics, personal leadership from the front. For much of 1941-42, Rommel seemed unstoppable, but success was precarious. His supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, facing British submarines and aircraft from Malta. Surface ships attacking convoys. Rommel starved of supplies. By late 1942, the tide turned. General Bernard Montgomery took command. New equipment arrived, Sherman tanks among them. The stage was set at El Alamein. The fate of North Africa hung in the balance. Stalingrad and the turning point in Europe. After the humiliating failure to take Moscow, Hitler's ambitions on the Eastern Front shifted south. The new offensive, codenamed Case Blue, targeted the vast, oil-rich Caucasus region to protect the long, vulnerable northern flank. Germany's 6th Army was tasked with seizing the city of Stalingrad. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic value, redirected them to aid in the capture of Stalingrad. This decision proved to be a fateful strategic error. The city of Stalingrad stretched for over 25 miles along the western bank of the mighty Volga River, a major industrial center, now churning out T-34 tanks. In late August 1942, the German assault on Stalingrad began. The Luftwaffe unleashed a massive bombing campaign. Instead, it created a hellscape ideal for defense. The German 6th Army, now forced into brutal urban combat, advanced street by street, house by house, room by room. They called it Rottenkrieg, the Rat War. The defense of Stalingrad was underpinned by Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, not one step back. Soviet soldiers were caught between the relentless German assault from the front and the threat of a bullet from their own side from behind. In this urban nightmare, the sniper became a key weapon. Soviet snipers terrorized the German troops, adding another layer of constant, nerve-shredding tension to the battle. While the German 6th Army was being drawn deeper into the hell of Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command was quietly preparing a massive counterstroke. On November 19, 1942, in the midst of a blinding blizzard, the Soviet counteroffensive began Operation Uranus, aiming the encirclement of Axis forces in the vicinity of Stalingrad. The German 6th Army, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, and portions of the German 4th Panzer Army. The Romanian defenses collapsed almost immediately. Just 4 days later, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach. The trap was sprung. General Friedrich Paulus's entire 6th Army, a force of nearly 300,000 men, was now completely surrounded. Hitler forbade Paulus from attempting to break out. Inside the cauldron, the situation for the trapped German soldiers became desperate. Starving, freezing, and under constant attack, the 6th Army slowly wasted away. Their surrender was now only a matter of time. A different kind of hell, the Holocaust, intensifies. As the war of armies reached its turning point, another, more sinister war against civilians was escalating, the most intense phase of the Holocaust. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference. They formalized the final solution, coordinating the bureaucratic and logistical machinery needed for the industrial-scale extermination of an entire people. Jews from across Europe were rounded up. Upon arrival at the camps, they were subjected to a horrifying selection process. The elderly, the sick, and young children were sent directly to their deaths in gas chambers. Able-bodied men and women were selected for slave labor. The camps were factories of death, operating with chilling assembly line precision. While soldiers were dying on the battlefields of Stalingrad and North Africa, millions of men, women, and children were being murdered in a cold, calculated, and bureaucratic genocide. A stain on history that can never be erased. The years between 1941 and 1943 represent a fundamental transformation in the nature of human conflict. This was the period when regional wars coalesced into a single, indivisible global struggle. This was no longer a European war or an Asian conflict. It was the Second World War in its most absolute and terrifying form, a non-stop, all-encompassing struggle for survival and dominance that would define an era and scar generations to come. On land, the war reached a new zenith of ferocity. At sea, the oceans became a global chessboard for naval power. In the air, the conflict brought war to the heart of nations. And alongside these campaigns rose a different, more profound horror. The Holocaust, formalized and accelerated, became a war against humanity. This cold, bureaucratic extermination is the most chilling expression of total war. A conflict that aimed not just to defeat an enemy, but to erase a people from existence. As 1943 drew to a close, the world was irrevocably altered. The Axis tide had crested and begun to recede. The human cost was already astronomical, a toll measured in millions of lives lost on the frozen steppes, in sweltering jungles, in the depths of the ocean, and in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Ideology and ambition could fuel a war of annihilation. Racial hatred could turn battles into some of the most savage fighting in history. The Holocaust serves as a timeless, harrowing warning. The legacy of total war is one of profound transformation. It accelerated technological change, shattered old empires, and gave rise to new global superpowers. It redrew the map of the world. In the end, the story of 1941 to 1943 is a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming darkness. It is also the story of the quiet, desperate courage of those who faced the Holocaust. To remember these years is not merely to recount battles and strategies, but to honor the immense human sacrifice they demanded. It is our duty to bear witness, to learn from this inferno, and to ensure that the flames of total war are never again unleashed upon the world. Victory and Reckoning, the end of the Second World War. The Tehran Conference, held between Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill from 28th November to 1st December 1943, was the first of the Allied World War II conferences involving the Big Three, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The meeting occurred shortly after the Cairo Conference was held in Egypt for a discussion between the United States, the United Kingdom, and China from 22 to 26 November 1943. Although the three leaders arrived in Tehran with differing objectives, the main outcome of the meeting was a British and American commitment to opening a second front against Nazi Germany, thereby forcing it to pull military assets away from the Eastern Front with the Soviets. So, in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, across the churning gray waters of the English Channel, the largest amphibious force ever assembled moved. This was Operation Overlord, D-Day. More than a military operation, a desperate, monumental gamble. The fate of the free world rested on these soldiers. Boys from the farms of Iowa, from the factories of Manchester, from the small towns of Ontario. Barely men, they faced the most fortified coastline in the world, the Atlantic Wall. Landing craft slammed ashore, ramps came down, soldiers plunged into fire and chaos. The water turned red. This was the beginning of the end, a story of victory and of reckoning. The D-Day landings were a foothold, but the summer of 1944 was a season of grinding, brutal attrition in the hedgerow hell of the Norman countryside. Each hedgerow could conceal an ambush. Progress was not measured in miles, but in hedgerows taken, inch by bloody inch. But as the German lines crumbled, the advance brought liberation. The joy was explosive, a release of years of pent-up fear. By winter, complacency set in. But in December, Hitler planned one last, desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. Their stubborn defense denied the Germans the critical road network they needed, buying precious time for the Allies to react. In March 1945, a stroke of luck. The Allies found a bridge across the Rhine still standing, striking a blow against the German soul. The final barrier was broken. As armies advanced on the ground, another war was waged from the skies. In February 1945, the controversial raid on Dresden created a firestorm that consumed the historic center. While the Western Allies drove into Germany, the Soviet Red Army unleashed overwhelming power on Berlin. For them, it was the ultimate prize, a symbol of vengeance. On April 30th, 1945, they raised the Soviet flag over the ruined parliament. The heart of the thousand-year Reich had been torn out. 50 feet below, in a concrete grave, Hitler's world crumbled into delusion and betrayal. On the same day the flag was raised over the Reichstag, he took his own life. As soldiers pushed deeper into Germany, they stumbled upon places not on any map. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found inside. This was the Holocaust. The discovery revealed an evil so profound it would forever stain the conscience of the world. On May 7th, the German High Command formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. While Europe celebrated, the war in the Pacific raged on. The island-hopping campaign was a slow, methodical, and incredibly bloody process. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa provided a horrifying preview of the fanaticism of Japanese resistance, with casualty rates shockingly high. A new, ruthless strategy of firebombing was unleashed. The raid on Tokyo was the single most destructive air raid in human history. Yet the Japanese government refused to surrender. Far from the battlefields, the Manhattan Project was initiated, a monumental effort to harness the very power that fuels the stars. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the spectacle, famously recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was used. In an instant, the world below was incinerated. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from horrific burns and radiation sickness. Despite the horror, the Japanese government remained deadlocked. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The twin shocks of the bombs, combined with the Soviet declaration of war, finally broke the stalemate. The silence that fell across the battlefields echoed with the ghosts of more than 70 million dead. Germany, Italy, and Japan were defeated and occupied by the Allied forces. Germany lost all territories east of the Oder-Neisse line to Poland and the Soviet Union, including parts of Silesia, East Prussia, and Pomerania. The remaining Germany was divided into 4 zones, each controlled by the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. All lands Germany had annexed before the war, such as Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, were returned to their respective countries. Millions of ethnic Germans who lived in the territories lost to Poland and the Soviet Union were forcibly expelled and forced to resettle in Germany. Much of Europe and Asia was in ruins, and millions were left displaced or as refugees. The systematic genocide of Jews and other minorities by the Nazi regime resulted in millions of deaths and remains a defining tragedy of the war. Major Axis leaders were tried for war crimes at tribunals in Nuremberg and Tokyo, establishing that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Out of the wreckage grew a desperate, powerful resolve: never again. New institutions were born, founded on the hope that humanity could learn from its most terrible lesson. To prevent future global conflicts, the United Nations was created as an international organization to promote peace and cooperation. The old European powers like Britain and France declined in influence, while the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the dominant global powers. Ideological conflicts between the US and the Soviet Union intensified, leading to a period of geopolitical tension, the Cold War. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the beginning of the nuclear age, which led to a nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. Many countries faced severe economic problems, which were addressed in part by the US Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe. The focus on military technology in the war spurred other advancements, and nations like Germany and Japan, previously restricted from building up military, focused more on technology. The Second World War stands as a watershed in human history. It taught us the depths of our depravity and the heights of our courage. Its legacy is the world we inhabit today, and we are left with the solemn duty to remember. If you like the content, leave your like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for following us. Albo.